Okay, I think that we can start. Hello to everyone and welcome to the UFMG Constitutionalism and Democracy Seminar Series. The seminars are an initiative of the graduate program in law of Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil, and the Digital Cons UFMG Content Governance Research with the support of the UFMG Study Center on Transnational Justice, the UFMG GNet Research Group, and the UFMG Center on Transnational and Comparative Juridical Studies, the ICONES Chapter Brazil, the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of the Semi-Arid Brazil, the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of Uberlândia, Brazil, University of Brasilia, Brazil, and the Brazilian Association of Political Philosophy and Constitutional Law, Brazil. Although the results of the presidential elections in the United States indicated a point of constitutional resilience, the worldwide trend on democratic and constitutional erosion is still in place. Against this background, the seminar series on constitutionalism and democracy aim to create an online forum of topical, vivid, and interactive academic debate. This series of events provide opportunity for distinguished, emerging, and early career scholars to discuss the main concerns and challenges affecting the current constitutional jurisdictions around the world from the perspective of comparative constitutional analysis. Today, we have the honor to host as keynote speakers Professor Rosalind Dixon and David Landau. Professor Rosalind Dixon is a professor of law at the University of New South Wales, Faculty of Law. She earned her BA and LLB from the University of New South Wales and was an associate to the Chief Justice of Australia, the Honorable Murray Gleeson, before attending Harvard Law School, where she obtained an LLM and SGD. Professor
David, you don't have to
Landau,
introduce me for yeah, that's great. Thanks.
I hope I don't make any mistakes here. So where am I? Yes, Professor David Landau is a Mason-led professor and Associate Dean for International Programs at the Florida State University College of Law. Professor Landau was a PhD in Political Science by the Harvard University and a GD by the same institution. Their publication has been cited by courts all over the world. Their new book is about abusive constitutional borrowing, legal globalization, and the subversion of liberal democracy, published by Oxford University Press. To act as a discussant in this panel, we are pleased to welcome Professor Mila Versteeg. Professor Versteeg is Professor of Law and Director of Human Rights Program at the University of Virginia School of Law. She holds an LLM by Harvard Law School, DPhil by the University of Oxford, and a Master in Rechten by Tilburg University. Professor Versteeg's work have appeared as the most cited ones in different rankings. In co-authorship with Adam Shilton, she received the prize of Best Book published in 2020 by ICONES last week for How Constitutional Rights Matter, published by Oxford University Press. The format of this event today is the following. First, our keynote speakers talk about abusive constitutional borrowing for more or less 30 minutes. Our discussant has 15 minutes for sharing her views and comments. After that, we will have a Q&A session in which the audience can make comments and ask questions. Please, for this, use the chat function. I would like to thank our team, Ulysses, Ana Luisa, Bruno, and Natasha for helping us in organization of this series. The videos of the seminar series are already available on YouTube, and we are recording this panel too. If you disagree with that, please turn off your cameras. Thank you very much for the panelists and the discussant for accepting this invitation, and thank you for I thank the audience also for joining us today. Rose, David, I'm looking forward to your presentation, especially in the light of the recent decisions of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal in connection to judicial independence. Last month, the tribunal declared the decision of the European Court of Human Rights as a non-existent one, and today it declared an interim decision of the European Court of Justice unconstitutional. Thank you again. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Timo, and thank you for the invitation. It's a really remarkable feat that UFMG is bringing people together from all around the world in this way. I see many Brazilian colleagues as well as Masako Kamiya and Jim Gardner from Japan and the United States, my colleague Raul Sanchez-Uribari from Australia. So thank you so much for the invitation, but also for bringing us together. And congratulations to all of the parts of the university, as well as ICONS Brazil, for doing so much to bring us together as a comparative community at what is a challenging time still in so many parts of the world. Obviously, abusive borrowing is not only of interest in Poland, but it is a topic which has real relevance to ongoing debates and challenges in Brazil. And one of the things we'll be really interested to discuss is the sort of theoretical frame and Mila's response, but also to hear from colleagues in Brazil about how they think it relates to Bolsonaro's tenure and some of the tactics that have been employed recently in Brazil. When you write a book about the world, one of the great challenges is how much of the world to put in. And David and I did spend some time debating what was on the cutting floor and what was left out. And we felt that things were moving so fast and so dynamically in Brazil that we felt that that was a topic we wanted to come back to another day rather than put in the book. The book is out just 48 hours ago, so this is officially the global launch. So we're especially, delighted to have this opportunity. Hold it up again, David. It looks good. So we're going to just divide our remarks into two. I'm going to talk a little bit about the broad kind of framework, and then David's going to talk about some of the case studies and possible solutions to the phenomenon before we turn it over to Mila. We start this book with the kind of ideas that David developed by himself in his 2013 article, Abusive Constitutionalism. And we extend it to look at the full ways in which would-be authoritarians can abuse the tools and mechanisms of democratic constitutionalism. And that remains an ongoing agenda of our joint research. But this book, Abusive Borrowing, is about a specific part of that problem. It's about the ways in which comparative and international law have and continue to be used by would-be authoritarians as both inspiration for and justification for the strategies of abusive constitutional change and erosion. So the basic context is twofold. It is one, that we live in an age of democratic erosion or backsliding, which David labelled abusive constitutionalism, and two, that global norms, so comparative and international norms, are a check in some cases on that trend. And we don't want to give up on the global as a check, but they can also be used as a tool for erosion in ways that have been under notice and which call for much greater care and attention on the part of us as global scholars. So some people have said to us, why pay attention to comparative and international law if you think it's only part of the problem? And the answer to that is that we as comparativists and international law scholars have more control over this aspect of the problem than some other aspects. If part of what drives democratic backsliding or abusive constitutionalism are meta trends around immigration and economics and how democratic politics responds, as comparative scholars, our tools for responding to that are limited. However, if one of the problems that is contributing to current trends is the abuse of our shared discourse, we have more power to call that out, to name it in ways that might limit its efficacy as a tool of abusive constitutional change. So what do we mean precisely by abusive borrowing? I want to note that the word borrowing is used here in a metaphorical sense to mean either the inspiration or justification of practices by reference to comparative and international precedents. And what do we mean by the word abuse? We mean any use or inspiration, use being the relevant word here, that has the tendency to undermine what David and I have called the minimum core of democracy. As individuals and jointly, we have a quite capacious conception of liberal democracy. But we argue in our scholarship that it is useful to adopt, when talking about abusive constitutionalism, a relatively thin definition that is capable of commanding the assent of all reasonable citizens and political theorists, namely a definition of democracy that emphasizes three things. First, the idea of free and fair multi-party elections. Two, the idea of political rights and freedoms necessary to sustain true participation and contestation in electoral democracy. And three, a set of institutional checks and balances capable of protecting and realising commitments 1 and 2. That is not a purely thin or purely procedural conception of democracy, but it is relatively thin in ways that we suggest represent an overlapping consensus among all reasonable conceptions of democracy and, importantly, a reasonable and overlapping consensus among all actual constitutional democracies worldwide. And one of the principles we've suggested in the book and elsewhere is that transnational practice, or what we call transnational anchoring, can guide and inform our understanding of the democratic minimum core. For the Europeans, or the Europeans in Brazil, this looks a little bit like the way the European Union thinks about practices when it comes to the European Convention on Human Rights and thinking about overlapping practices. It looks a bit like the Schengen and Copenhagen criteria. It's about generating overlapping practices and suggesting that they then guide the content of core norms. So abusive change or abusive borrowing occurs where there is change that impacts the democratic minimum core. It can be understood in either a stronger or a weaker sense. The weaker sense is simply an impact-based test, where there is change that adversely impacts the minimum core. The stronger understanding of abuse involves some sort of mental or mens rea element. The knowing, intentional, reckless use of the foreign in order to erode the democratic minimum core. And we suggest that in most cases, we are interested in the strong, not just the weak sense, the knowing abuse of democracy and foreign norms. But there is a value in highlighting both phenomena because we will have a different definition to match a different response. And secondly, because often it will be extremely hard to show that there is the strong form of abusive change or borrowing occurring, which is mental elements are notoriously difficult to ascertain in a collective context. Would-be authoritarians have every reason to hide their motives and understandings and intent. And often the ways in which we get to intent in this context will be via affect. Those of you who've studied US constitutional law will be familiar with cases like Gamillion and Yik Wo, where they rely on, if you like, egregious disparate impact in order to infer intent. And we suggest that will often be the case for abusive constitutionalism and abusive borrowing. Another source of guidance will be contextual and procedural. If there are massive procedural irregularities, departures from prior practice and precedent, that may also indicate strong form abusive borrowing, namely knowing misuse. But we think both are worthwhile and useful to notice and to bring within the definition of abusive borrowing. Third thing I want to highlight then is the different modes of abusive borrowing. We suggest that all borrowing is ultimately a process that follows something like Frankenberg's idea of decontextualization and recontextualization, although we don't think it has to be as radically decontextualized or as supermarket IKEA-like as Frankenberg suggests. But abusive borrowing is a form of decontextualization and recontextualization that is both more extreme and more overtly anti-democratic. It involves one of 4 techniques which often overlap, but is still useful to distinguish. First, radically superficial or sham forms of usage, the adoption of a foreign norm without any of its substance. And of course, Mila and David Law have written about this in a very helpful paper called Sham Constitutionalism, and no doubt we can talk about the overlap with that in due course. The second technique is radical selective borrowing, taking a rule without a defense, taking norm A without the accompanying norm B that people think are more or less inevitably necessary for the two to work well together. The classic example, which we cite drawing on work by people like Alvin Chung in this area, is to take libel law without appropriate defences. And of course, people like Raoul who's written about Venezuela in great detail will know just how much that has been a technique and tool in Venezuela. But you can see it in Poland and elsewhere, and we talk about numerous examples that David will highlight in just a minute. The third mode or form of abusive borrowing is acontextual. It is taking a norm that really only works where certain preconditions are present: competitive democracy, free and fair debate, reasonable disagreement, judicial independence, and then adopting the norm in the absence of those preconditions. So for instance, judicial tenure, the inability to remove judges and giving them lifelong tenure or a long period of guaranteed tenure makes sense where there are conditions of judicial independence. Where you have appointed a judge who is compromised and captured by the regime and has no independence, giving them extended guaranteed tenure may not have any of the same benefits as where there are conditions of judicial independence. And yet people frequently use the guaranteed tenure without the independence as a mode of abusive constitutional change. Fourth technique, which we think is, if anything, the least noticed and one of the most interesting, is what we call anti-purposive borrowing. It's taking norm A, which is designed to achieve A, and adopting it for the purpose of not A. So it's very opposite. And we have examples about memory laws and speaker's corner and a whole range of examples which David may mention in due course. But we want to acknowledge that these techniques overlap. They're not hermeneutically sealed from each other, and they have some continuity with any form of legitimate borrowing, namely decontextualization and recontextualization. But in their impact, purpose, and extremity, we think they are quite distinct and are at the heart of what we mean by the problem of abusive borrowing. So with that, David, I'll turn it over to you, and I might say a last word after you conclude.
Great. Thanks so much, Rosalind. Thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's fun to talk about it. Fun in a kind of bad way to talk about this project, and hopefully it's interesting to the audience, and grateful to Mila as well for taking the time to comment. So we go through a number of examples, as Roz mentioned briefly. It's a mix, so some of these are better known. We deal with some cases that are kind of used in the literature as kind of classic cases of abusive constitutionalism: Poland, Hungary, Venezuela. But we also try to pick up on a number of cases that are much less known, and are kind of not part of the sort of usual suspects. That said, as Roz mentioned, there's a number of important cases we couldn't pick up on for various reasons, or chose to not to treat in the book for different reasons, complexity, or just how fast the landscape was moving. And Brazil is one of those. We're hopeful that the book is useful, though, for cases outside of the book, and can get kind of picked up as an analytic tool for those other cases. So I would say, like, the centerpiece of the book in a lot of ways is going through how this works or happens in a number of different jurisdictions. We start with kind of two major sort of centerpieces of liberal democratic constitutionalism: rights and courts. And in rights, we go through a number of examples. The example of hate speech in Rwanda, and memory laws in Poland and Russia, both of which were used are kind of designed to protect rights to things like dignity and equality, but we argue were used in these contexts in ways that were instead designed, certainly a liberal design, to repress minorities, but also probably most clearly in Rwanda used as a tool that attacked the democratic minimum core. We look at voting rights in Hungary and Fiji. So Hungary is kind of an interesting example, the sort of selective extension of voting rights to groups outside of the country, right? So we're gonna expand the franchise to expatriates. There's a number of European documents that say this is good, right? This is what you want. But of course, the way this is done in Hungary, it brings in the kind of aspects of the Hungarian diaspora, or people of Hungarian descent located elsewhere in Eastern Europe, very much allied with Fidesz, and makes it much harder for people to vote, for example, in Western Europe, right? Who are likely to oppose the regime. We look at gender quotas again in Rwanda, an interesting example where there was a lot of international attention given to Kagame because of the promotion of gender equality in the region. These gender quotas for political posts was part of that, but these quotas were also used as a basically consolidation mechanism for the authoritarian regime, right? And so that's a really interesting example where there's a real divergence with, you know, the knowledge or interests of the international community, or both. Finally, look at environmental rights in Ecuador, which were, there's an interesting story there about, you know, they were included with the concordance of both domestic and international groups, right? Both domestic civil society and international actors really wanted environmental rights to be put into the Ecuadorian constitution. Essentially, this is an example of what Raz has called constitutional rights as bribes, we argue, right? In other words, the environmental rights were put in there, but this was a bad bargain in the sense that it was, I guess you could say, a kind of sham-like bribe, right? That there was never really an intent to carry out the rights. And shortly after the Constitution was put into place, in fact, the environmental leaders were repressed, right, put in jail, etc. And the Correa administration wrote memos to judges basically saying, don't, you know, if you enforce this stuff, you're going to be personally liable for doing so. So it's an interesting example of, like, again, you have the celebrated constitution at an international level, which has all of these very interesting rights in it, and what's really going on. We look next at courts, what Roz and I call abusive judicial review, which is kind of abusive in two senses, right? First is the regime, and I think this was the piece that was actually distributed to the audience, right? But the regime uses abusive judicial review as a regime strategy. In other words, certain acts, you kind of launder them through courts because you get less pushback from international or domestic audiences from doing so. And so if you're going to carry out an anti-democratic act, like banning an opposition party, for example, it's easier in a lot of contexts to do so by court. But courts themselves are also prolific abusive constitutional borrowers. They use liberal democratic doctrines, often after being captured, in ways that are themselves abusive, right? They turn liberal democratic norms into anti-democratic tools. The main examples we go through in the chapter, the banning of parties in Cambodia and Thailand, just for a lack of time, I won't go deeply into it, but Cambodia is the most dramatic example where basically the court banned the opposition party after it looked like Cambodia was actually transitioning into a more democratic state, banned the party that had launched a surprising challenge to the incumbents, and basically helped to re-authoritarianize, I'm not sure that's a term, the Cambodian, Cambodian state. And we also look at the Venezuelan Supreme Court, which used a number of doctrines that are sort of fascinating from the standpoint of abuse, a number of doctrines affiliated with liberal democratic norms to repress the opposition-controlled Congress after the Congress was won by the opposition at the end of 2015. Then we look at kind of two other pieces that also have an interesting relationship with liberal democratic constitutionalism. Constituent power, which if you think about it in some ways is kind of foundational of the notion of liberal democratic constitutionalism, the idea that the people are the ultimate source of authority and have the power to remake their constitutional order. We look at the abuse of constituent assemblies in Latin America, in places like Venezuela in 1999, 2017, and in Ecuador in 2008. The kind of ultimate end of this, in some ways, is the Venezuelan 2017 assembly, right, which asserts the kind of power of the people in a sort of sham-like way, but doesn't even bother writing a new constitution, right? Instead spends all of its time essentially repressing opposition-controlled institutions, holding elections under dubious conditions, et cetera. We also look at the kind of flip side of constituent power. One piece of this is the ability of the people to remake their constitutional order, so the abuse of constitution making. But the other is the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, the kind of limit, right, on the constituted institutions in the name of the people. And we look at the use of this to remove term limits from constitutions across Latin America. The arguments that were used that are related to the doctrine in places like Nicaragua, Honduras, Bolivia, also in a different way in places like Ecuador and Venezuela. And finally, in that chapter, we look at the abuse of the international law supports, so the unconstitutional, the way that a kind of unconstitutional government argument was leveraged in Fiji to legitimize a coup, and the use of kind of legal pluralism and constitutional identity type arguments in Hungary and Poland to legitimize authoritarian projects. Finally, we look at political constitutionalism, so the sort of branch of liberal democratic constitutionalism that argues that courts should be relatively restrained and constitutional interpretation and enforcement should be placed more in political actors. And we look at the abuse of those kinds of arguments, which were used to attack the judiciary in Poland and Hungary, right? We argue for anti-democratic ends, and also the argument to add a general override clause, kind of Canadian-style override clause in Israel. We argue this too, although it's a difficult case, right? A tricky case. In its context, was kind of an attempted abusive borrowing because in its context, one of the primary aims was to grant Netanyahu potentially immunity from prosecution, right? So at least the kind of latest iteration of the override clause in Israel was aimed at attacking the democratic minimum core. So that's kind of a tour sort of overview of some of the major examples we go through in the book. As you can see, we try to be sort of broad, and comprehensive, and pick up on a range of regions and more study and kind of lesser study cases. The last couple minutes of the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about the last chapter where we sort of deal with solutions, right? Like what does this phenomenon mean? What can we do about it? Hopefully we've succeeded in convincing readers that this is pretty pervasive, that this goes on a lot. What does one make of it? And in part, I think that one of our major goals is just kind of recognition, right? In other words, to make people more tuned to the sort of dark side of this particular dark side of liberal democratic constitutionalism that exists, that these tools that are out there that are often quite celebrated, in fact, are very easily and readily made into sort of double-edged swords that can have anti-democratic effects, right? So the sort of rhetorical triumph of liberal democratic constitutionalism itself has a pretty clear dark side. But we do have sort of three bundles of thoughts on what might be done. I would say here we're kind of bracketing constitutional design. Roz and I have worked on that elsewhere. We have an ongoing project on constitutional design and the resilience of democratic constitutions. But what we're thinking about here are more conceptual level responses, right, to the phenomenon. The first is about monitoring, right? It's kind of a cluster of concerns about monitoring, designing better institutions more attuned to the nature of the threat. Some of this picks up on what other scholars like Kim Williams Shepley have been thinking along these veins, right? But obviously, a broader scope is better. A less formalism at the international level is better, right? Particularly when you're dealing with institutions like courts. And overall, more of a legal realist response, we argue, and a sort of less formal attitude towards law is often a valuable thing at the transnational level. Related to that, more skepticism in many contexts of courts, who, as we've shown throughout the book, are prolific abusive constitutional borrowers, right? So, without essentially throwing out the norm, which is a good norm, right? That judicial independence is important, and we want courts to exist and be able to function. They often carry out valuable tasks. A little bit more skepticism of what it is that judges are actually doing is generally, I would argue, a good thing, right? In many of these contexts. The second cluster is about the design of norms themselves. This is probably the most directly pointed towards audiences like this one, right, in the community of scholars working on liberal democracy. When thinking about the design and promulgation of norms, liberal democratic norms, our main point is you should factor the likelihood of abuse in, right? A recognition that liberal democratic norms can be abused and are sometimes a very valuable machinery for abuse. Doesn't mean you can always stop it, but you should aim to do better, right? One possibility in the extreme, which we think should be contemplated, although we tend to reject it with respect to the examples we go through in the book, is to get rid of a norm entirely because the risk of abuse is too high, right? In other words, the risk of abuse is so high, you don't create the norm. There are some where I think that at least the question should be asked, right? I mean, one example that is interesting, has gotten some scholarly play recently, is the constitutional identity doctrine in Europe, right? The idea of constitutional identity, the risks of abuse or misuse may be high enough that one should consider whether the doctrine should exist. Ultimately, it's a complex question. I doubt even there that that's the right answer, right? But we do think the question ought to be asked. Another more common kind of response is to abuse proof as best as you can, right? Understand where the ambiguities are and tighten them. And we think there's a lot of kind of low-hanging fruit here, right? If one looks at the way norms are promulgated or thought about transnationally in international law, there's often a kind of blindness to the risk of abuse. Again, you can't eliminate it, but we think if you're more cognizant of it, you can design norms in ways that are more attuned. Some of that goes to sort of how norms are promulgated. Are they promulgated as simple technologies? You know, as for example, some scholars have done with the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, or are they promulgated with a thicker kind of teleology? And we think in a lot of cases that teleology kind of needs to be there as a part of the story of what the norm is doing, what it is supposed to do. And you look at cases like the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, where, to be frank, the risk of abuse in the empirical record is really high, right? In fact, you could argue the misuses are kind of more prevalent than the proper use. There's clearly a lot of scholarly work to be done there in trying to improve the design of the norm. Another point is about the harm posed by the abuse from liberal democratic actors. This is, in other words, what do you do when states that are liberal democratic misuse norms, what Roz and I call kind of proto-abuse? And we do go through some examples in the book. One that many of you might be familiar with are like the misuse of the constitutional identity doctrine and related doctrines in Germany. And the probably a lesser known one is that the kind of initial case of abuse of the right of re-election in Latin America was actually in Costa Rica, which furnished the argument that then was picked up by a bunch of basically authoritarian actors to remain in power essentially indefinitely. And we think there's some interesting questions to be raised about, you know, might it be easier in some circumstances to kind of stamp out abuse when it's carried out by liberal democratic states? It's also, we think, important that the demonstration effect of those states on more authoritarian contexts can be pretty significant. Final set of responses, and here I'll conclude, is about the way we debate liberal democratic constitutionalism. So abusive constitutional borrowing thrives on a certain kind of mimicry. One way to deal with this, we think, is experimentation. Should be less dogmatic about the content of liberal democratic constitutionalism, should encourage experimentation, arguably even in areas like economic policy where we may be uncomfortable. The red line for us, and we think this is one of the analytic values of the book, is the democratic minimum core, right? In other words, that's where you don't want to experiment, essentially, but you want to encourage experimentation outside of that core. And in that sense, too, we hope the analytic tools of the volume are useful. It gives analysts a way to determine what should be treated as out of bounds, and also to kind of evaluate what's going on. One thing that one does see is that very often, you know, you take an actor like Viktor Orban, who says, basically, I'm an illiberal, right? But identifies as a Democrat. In other words, I'm like basically an illiberal democratic actor. One thing I think that the book helps to show is that it's really not true, right? That the moves are certainly illiberal, but they are also things that attack the democratic minimum core. Indeed, empirically, many of the moves against liberalism also end up being moves against the democratic minimum core, thus, we think, showing that at least certain safeguards or pieces of liberalism are actually kind of core protections of the minimum democratic order, right? They actually are tied in with elections themselves. And so I think the one thing that this lets us do is say we should have experimentation in order to attain a richer conception and understanding of liberal democratic constitutionalism, a better, more effective set of tools or ways to solve problems, less mimicry, but at the same time, a clear sense of when moves are effectively authoritarian, such that the set of actors who are out there who say, like, we don't want this liberal baggage, but we are Democrats, right? We enjoy the legitimacy of the people. One thing we hope this volume allows people to do is come up with more effective responses to those lines of argumentation. And then with that, I'll stop and see if Roz wants to add anything.
Thank you so much. So I think that Rosalind, you want to say no, not now. Okay, then Mila, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for organizing and inviting me. I'm obviously honored to be commenting on this book during its global launch, which is really great. I mean, I think it's a very successful project, and it takes up a very important question and deals with it really well. So I will maybe start by talking a little bit about what I took from the book as its main contributions, and the hope that that's helpful, although some of that had already been covered, I guess, in Russ and David's comments, and then make some comments of my own of, maybe some points of critique or discussion or whatever. So obviously the book tackles the topic of democratic erosion, which is a really big topic, has been a really big topic in the literature, both in law and political science, but through the lens of abusive constitutional borrowing, which the book defines as the appropriation of liberal democratic constitutional design concepts and doctrines in order to advance authoritarian projects, right? And abusive constitutional borrowing paradoxically happens in an age where there is widespread dialogue between constitutional systems, but the dialogue doesn't necessarily produce liberal constitutionalism as we think it, or maybe inclined to think it does, as I in my prior work probably was inclined to think it did, but it can undermine it. And this is often because the form is decoupled from the substance. So the form of the change may seem democratic, but the substance is not, right? So, and the book does a lot of things, and it's obviously one of the most important accounts, or the most important accounts of the phenomenon. I mean, I thought some of the things that I was really taking notes when I was reading it, and thought these are, the things I should definitely remember and keep in my mind going forward dealing with this literature is so I think is, first of all, it helps us identify when projects are abusive, and they do so through this concept of the minimum democratic core, right? Because we read about or we hear about certain reforms, and so when are these in the category of abusive judicial review, or abusive constitutionalism, or abusive borrowing, and so they have this project of the minimum this concept of the minimum democratic core, which, and I'm quoting this, at the very least entails regular, free and fair elections with some minimum of level of competition between parties and a set of background conditions that includes respect for those political rights and freedoms necessary for democratic processes, as well as some conception of the rule of law and protection of independent institutions necessary to oversee elements of the democratic process. And as they say, it's a definition that's neither thick nor thin. I mean, my take of the definition is a little bit like, you know it when you see it, but I'll say a little bit more about this in my comments, because they do not want to give a checklist, because checklists are abused. But then the question is, when do we really know, when do we really see this kind of reforms that are abusive? It's a hard problem to solve. But I do think that the concept in and of itself is very, very useful. The problem maybe is that the concept itself is a little slippery. Then the book, I think also, I mean, and this obviously draws on David and Ross's and both of their earlier work, but it elaborates and illuminates the different forms of abusive change. So there can be formal amendments, there can be changes in organic law, there can be abusive judicial review, either in a strong or a weak form, there can be informal changes in constitutional conventions and so on. And then as Ross just elaborated, it talks about the different modes of abusive borrowing, which I also thought was tremendously helpful. So the sham borrowing, selective borrowing, a contextual borrowing, and anti-purposive borrowing. I will not repeat what they just said. And then I think another great contribution of the book is it provides so many examples and illustrations, including from understudied jurisdictions like Rwanda, Cambodia. I mean, it's really fantastic how it deals with all these different examples from throughout the world. And of course, I understand it's difficult, like which countries do you cover and which one do you not? But I mean, I think you guys did an enormous amount of work here, and I think it's great. And then finally, the book helps us think, what can we actually do about this phenomenon as well? So there is no doubt in my mind, this is a very important book, which we will be discussing for a long time to come. So I wanted to congratulate you on that. So in terms of my comments, I guess I had three broad set of thoughts, and I'll start with, I think, maybe my most pressing comment. So as I was reading the book, I kept wondering whether you could tell me more, perhaps, and maybe this is not this project, but about the motivations of these wannabe autocrat that pursue this kind of change that is formally democratic, right? So in other words, you tell us a whole lot about the how, but you tell us less about the why. And you seem to suggest, well, this is mainly the international context. So you say, oh, in a globalized world, authoritarianism has become more legalistic as a survival strategy in response to changes in the international and transnational level. Because if something looks formally democratic, first of all, it's not that obvious that there's abuse, and international actors may hesitate calling out this out as abuse because it's not obvious that it's actually undemocratic, and maybe they'll open themselves up to similar types of critique. So you mainly focus on the international context. You gesture a little bit to the domestic, right? So you say important domestic constituencies may misunderstand abuse of constitutional borrowing as a pro-democratic rather than an anti-democratic move, giving it increased legitimacy. But I wanted to know more about the domestic political economy, I guess, or the micro foundations of what's going on here. So I specifically wondered whether the supporters of Viktor Orban, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, do they really care how these changes are pursued? Do they care that this looks formally democratic, even if it's not, right? They give these leaders a mandate against the liberal democratic order. And there's some interesting work in political science by Milan Šlofovčík, or I'm mispronouncing his name. He's at Yale, and he's done these very interesting survey experiments. And he basically shows in highly polarized settings, supporters of populist leaders, they don't care at all how it's done, as long as it's done, right? They prioritize partisan values over democracy, right? So they're willing to sacrifice democracy. So then if that's the case, do they care that something looks formally democratic, right? And it's also somewhat hard to believe that these leaders are indeed feel constrained by the international order, right? In part because the international order has increasing number of guys like them. I mean, I attended this talk by a woman who was a really great talk about human rights, and who had people from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And they're basically saying, how do we call out, I don't know, abusive or undemocratic moves in a post-shame world, right? We used to do naming and shaming. That's what the international liberal order was all about, but we live in a post-shame world. So does naming and shaming really help, right? So if that is true, right, they're like part of their mandate is operating against the international order, and they don't really care about the Constitution either, then why do they even bother trying to pursue this kind of change in this manner, right? I guess I just kept feeling not entirely satisfied on that, but I also know that if I mean, it's a hard question, and it's actually some topic I've been doing some thinking on myself, and I'd love to get your take on, and maybe we can have a longer conversation about that. But I've been doing some initial research looking at, asking supporters of populist leaders, do they care how it's done? And the answer is no, they don't. But then those who vote for establishment parties often do care how it's done. So maybe it's like the other side who cares, right? So the domestically, but I don't know. I mean, I guess this was one question that I felt like I would love to have the book do more on, but maybe that's for the book already covers a lot of ground, right? So maybe that's for a future project. My second comment was really about the minimum democratic core. So I think I haven't fully fleshed out these thoughts other than that I think it's really important that we have this benchmark, but also I'm not sure that it's ultimately possible to define it, right? So my ultimate take on how what I come away with your definition is you kind of say you know it when you see it, right? When we cannot give a checklist, but we'll know when these changes are undermining democracies. But thinking about this, I guess I had two different responses that went in completely different directions. So my first response was, yeah, of course, everybody will know that what they're doing is disingenuous and like people are not so easily fooled. But if that's true, then why would they try to hide it in democratic form, right? If everybody sees this anyway. And then my other response is like, maybe actually it's really hard to detect this. And I kept being reminded of Turkey. So I was in Turkey I think it was in 2017, and I was interviewing some people there for the book that I was writing at the time. And one of the, Turkey obviously has seen major democratic decline, in part through law. And then I kept asking people, where did the end begin, right? Where did this all start? And a lot of the scholars I spoke to said it was really the 2010 referendum that did a lot of different things at once. So it removed amnesty for coup makers from the 1980s, which was very popular. It increased standing or access to the Constitutional Court, which was also popular. And then it had some technical changes about how to appoint judges. And I still remember, and people said at the time, we just, liberals and the law professors, they were all in favor of voting yes at the referendum because nobody really saw that coming, that these changes would ultimately change the judiciary. And then I had lunch a little later in Vienna, sometime with Snoech Dur, who is a member of the Venice Commission, who wrote a report on Turkey from the Venice Commission. And he basically said over lunch, like, yeah, we were in favor of this amendment. We thought it was good. And then it turned out it wasn't, right? Because it had some good things, it had some bad things. So which leaves me wondering, do you know it when you see it, or maybe not, right? So, and maybe I guess I'm maybe just rambling. I guess my takeaway was, I think it's really important that what you're doing with defining the minimum democratic quorum, but I also think it's incredibly hard to actually operationalize that in a way that is neither thin nor thick and is not a checklist, but then at the same time relies on people detecting it, which they may or they may not. Maybe that's where I guess I feel confused. Okay, final point. So I thought I really loved the chapter on how rights are abused, in part of because I've been researching rights. So I thought there was some really striking examples. And your story on Ecuador made me wonder whether that's the story on Ecuador or whether there may be another story on abusing rights, which is a bit more of a meta story. So you say in Ecuador, there were environmental groups supported inclusion of environmental rights. And then they got this, they supported the constitution with an overly strong presidency. So basically rights were bribes, as Rosalind called this in her prior work. But one of the striking things about the Ecuadorian constitution, as you mentioned, it's like everything is a right? Everything that is good is a right. And I wonder if this is an important way in which rights are abused globally, right? So I once gave lecture here at the University of Virginia. We have a military school, and I gave a lecture about the international human rights law to a bunch of military. They were all wearing uniform. I felt mildly intimidated, but it was interesting. And one of them raised their hand and it's like, Professor, you know, if everything is a priority, then obviously you don't have a priority, right? And I was like, that's pretty well put, right? So, but another way of saying this is like, when everything is a right, then everything becomes higher law. So if all good values are higher law, then basically you don't have higher law anymore, right? And I mean, and this is the intuition that's obviously articulated by Eric Posner in his book about the twilight of human rights, which is, everybody thinks it's about zombies, but it's not, it's about human rights. But in any case, he makes that argument. And then Jamal Green just came out with a book where he basically says the opposite, right? Oh, we need to have more values as rights instead of picking a few that are trumps. So I think it's actually, you know, it's an important question that different scholars have different views on. But my sense is, looking at the data, more rights is not better, right? More rights means that they can be abused. So I feel like that's maybe another way of thinking about rights abuse is like, once everything is a right, you basically don't protect any rights anymore. And the US Constitution may not be ideal in some ways, see Jamal's argument, but at least they pick some values that they think are most important and ought to be protected. Okay, so, okay, with that said, I have 7 more minutes to stay here, and then I have to, but I thank you so much for letting me comment on the book, and I'm sure we can have many more conversations.
Thank you so much, Mila. I think that now I would like to give the floor to Rose and David to reflect on that, so that Mila can actually hear. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. And there's some great questions from Jim and Ro in the chat, which we'll respond to after that. I have some thoughts, David, but did you want to go first? So I think in reverse order, Mila, these are wonderful, rich provocations, and thank you for the generous comments about the book. We're very grateful, and it means a lot. On rights, I think it's a fascinating question, and, you know, rightsification may actually be its own question that, you know, we should all be thinking about, including using your work. I just want to press, though, on what I think might be a reverse causation in what you just ended with, which is, you say, you know, more rights can be abused. It may actually be that more rights are a sign of abuse, not that that's per se more open to abuse, that we put more rights in because we're not taking them seriously. I think it may also, the causation may run in the other direction, which is rights lose meaning when they're everything, and that's your point. But I think it does depend a little bit on the sincerity of the inclusion, and also what I've written very briefly in an Australian context by what I would call a culture of compliance versus contestation or justification. If rights are about compliance, the more you have, the harder it is, because they clash, and so nothing is going to be protected. But if you see rights more in a kind of Habermasian, Alexian sense as having priorities, but more about actually a discourse of contestation, then more isn't necessarily less. It's just a different way of thinking about rights, which is closer to the Jamal Green vision than the Dworkinian vision. And so I think it's both a deeply important provocation, but I don't think it's quite as clear that it's always a bad thing for rights, but it certainly is going to have a complex and interesting relationship. The more rights may be better, it may be worse, it may be a sign of abuse, it may be a condition for abuse. On the democratic minimum core, I think you're absolutely right to suggest that it's really hard to tell. Often we only know after the fact that abuse has happened, when it is too late, except that it's not ever too late to kind of make a judgment that then may inform the future. But it is often too late. The one thing I would suggest is that our idea of transnational anchoring does give more purchase to the concept than, you know, the know it when you see it pornography test, which is, we say that where you are changing things that don't find support elsewhere, that is presumptively suspect. The Turkish example is a classic example of where it's only when you put the stuff together or you aggregate or accumulate that you can see there's a problem. And that's really the super hard case, and it's often when you only figure it out later. But I just want to stress that if we'd been talking to the Venice Commission in 2010, we would have said to them, you've got to put 2 parts of our work together, the impact part, right, which is the minimum core part, and the motive part. And if you had understood the motive and the sort of context, you actually would have searched harder to think about whether abuse was going on. And the mere fact, actually 2010 Turkey is a classic abusive borrowing story. It's taking things that look superficially liberal democratic and packaging them together with abusive motives to have abusive ends. And so I think that the Venice Commission, if they read our book, would actually say, hang on a minute, this is a context where we should have been more suspicious and we should have looked harder and we shouldn't have rubber stamped it. We should have asked harder questions and done more work to look at context, because the motives there were actually much clearer than the effects. And we can toggle between, if you like, impact and motive to get a more critical purchase than the practice has been to date. The first thing about micro foundations, I love that provocation, and obviously it's not in the book and it's future work. I mean, David and I have talked a bit about this. I want to suggest that authoritarians have at least 4 motives. They have, I want to amend that. They have at least 3 motives and 4 modes. So the 3 motives are pleasing their supporters, winning over some undecideds, and keeping the international community off their back when it comes to loans, membership, and sanctions. We focus on the book a lot about, the sanctions and the international part, but we do talk about the domestic. And as you say, it's more about undecideds than it is about the base. And it's interesting. I think there's a sort of self-conception point there that's maybe worth investigating, which is, maybe some of the stuff there is saying, we want to be able to think of ourselves as legitimate, even if we have pretty dark motives. The most interesting part of that would be, what does it mean to actually appeal to the base through abusive borrowing? Because it looks wrong, right? I mean, certainly in earlier work, we talk about how in Zimbabwe or Venezuela, appealing to the international is a kind of death wish. You don't want to be seen to be a liberal Democrat. It may be that there's a kind of Trumpian satisfaction in knowing that you're abusing the discourse that you hate, that you can sell to the base, right? It's like, and we all know that we're doing this in bad faith, and in doing it, we're kind of really upsetting our enemies in a way that's super kind of satisfying, right? There's also a degree to which authoritarians could be reclassified. The list that Dave and I have talked about and we're still working on is maybe authoritarians could be technocratic, populist, nationalistic, or repressive, and that the different kinds of authoritarian that are more populist, more technocratic might be more interested in this strategy than the nationalist repressive types. But David, you wanted to jump in on this point about micro foundations and motivation.
Yeah, let me just raise a couple quick points, because I know Mila, you have to leave in like a minute. So on the, I think on the, okay, so I want to pick up one point on the democratic minimum core thing. I agree completely that that's difficult, right? And I think it's often only going to be possible in retrospect. I mean, one point I want to pick up, I think, is that it's interesting. There is this ambiguity in modern regime theory and political science itself, I think, right? Which is that it depends on, because it depends now on tilting the electoral playing field in a significant way, right? That's the definition of a competitive authoritarian regime. That's not an easy thing to define. I think that there's more work that also needs to be done in poli-sci as to what exactly, how exactly that can be fleshed out. And hopefully our book is useful actually for that purpose. The only thing I want to say on the micro foundations, I completely agree. We, as you put it, we say more about the how than the why, right? It almost as a necessity of methodology, I think, given what we're doing. I think, though, this picks up some on what Roz was saying. I think the project you're doing about, surveying supporters and seeing what they think about methods, that's really interesting. I think it doesn't shock me that you've found from what you've done so far that they don't much care, a lot of them, right, how it's done. But I think there is this, like you look at, for example, Trump supporters in the US, and I think there's differences between the kind of base and the reluctant supporters. And I think there is some targeting of the reluctant supporters. I also think domestically opponents really matter. partly, I think in the sense Roz said, like you're just trying to kind of annoy the other side, right? But there also is this phenomenon where it's like, it makes it harder to respond. And I think that difficulty of response itself is very valuable. There's an analog at the international level, I think, where sometimes what's going on, there's like the lack of knowledge phenomenon, which happens, or like the kind of confusion about what the purpose is. But there also is this situation where I'm pretty sure that people know what's going on, but it's still much harder for them to formulate an effective kind of robust response because they're kind of like, well, it looks legal, right? So like that there is that aspect of the phenomenon as well. One last very quick point, the interest of NGOs and civil society really interesting here, where you do have this phenomenon that comes up sometimes in the book of like sort of single issue groups. So the kind of environmental groups in the Ecuadorian case, the gender equality groups with respect to Rwanda. And one thing you see in those examples that is disturbing is the focus on that issue, right? So that like this dovetails with either lack of knowledge or kind of inability to formulate a response, but there's also this kind of motivation issue where it's like, well, this is what we're going to focus on, right? And that piece is deeply disturbing. I think one of the points that comes through in the book is like, if you're trying to make these trades with wannabe autocrats or autocrats, it's a bad trade, right? And I think that aspect also is important. Roz, I think you wanted to jump in.
I'm going to interrupt. I say, if you have ideological blinders on, one of the reasons you might have that is you have childcare problems, and Mila has to go first. She has one single ideological blinder is her children need her to go and look after them. So we should let you go, Mila.
Thanks a lot, Mila.
Thank you, Mila. Thank you.
Yeah, I do think, the point that David was just making, the thing in the sort of gender example in Rwanda is really striking to me as a feminist, the degree to which international feminists kind of let their passion for gender equality blind them to the authoritarian context. I've been rewatching with my daughter in lockdown some of the episodes of The West Wing, and I remembered, in season 3, the debate about the Women's Leadership Council and their sense of like women's issues as opposed to the broader democratic context. And I think one of the messages of the book and my Rights as Bribes work is just that, you can be a single issue kind of political actor, but be careful how that single issue priority gets used and abused by the people you're interacting and negotiating with, which I think is David's point, right? Which is it's usually, if you have your blinders on, sure, have your blinders on as a matter of political commitment, but not as a matter of political tactic, because you'll get outplayed. David, you make about opposition is really interesting. And I would be really interested to press, sort of in a further conversation with the folks here as well as Miller, is that I think there's like a really perverse satisfaction that some of these guys get from messing with the discourse of the opposition. So it's not just like preemptive rebuttal. It's like, screw you liberals and your, and insert, gender politics, consultation politics, environmental politics, whatever. We're going to take your discourse and just slam it from the inside in a way that I think that it's almost like they get utility from that builds the base up, because the base loves it when they feel like you're really hosing the opposition. And so it is actually a base strategy as well as a preemptive rebuttal strategy if the base is sophisticated enough to understand that what you're doing is killing the opposition's rhetoric from within. But we'll pause because there's some really interesting comments and questions to make from Raul and Jim that'd be good to talk about as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I think that now we have like half an hour for discussion. So I think that I just would like to invite Jim and then Raul, if you are still with us, and then Emilio to ask their questions.
Okay, I mean, I put it in the chat. I'm just, I guess the basic question here is whether borrowing and sort of subversion of tactics is something that is unique to the, that it has the valence that you ascribe to it here, or whether it's sort of a general practice, that there are certain technologies of governance and people use and adapt them for their purposes depending upon the context. So the question deals specifically with liberal democracies borrowing authoritarian tactics.
So I think it's really important to recognize that this stuff traffics multiple directions. One of the things we say in, very recent earlier work is the idea that the would-be authoritarians also kind of traffic between East and West discourse. So sometimes they say, actually, we want to be more like China and Russia. And sometimes they say, see, we're just like Germany and the US. And there is also kind of the reverse that you point to. I think the difference that one could clearly draw is the motive, which is I do think that when true liberal Democrats borrow from illiberal contexts, they're normally doing it to try and readapt and make it more democratic. I gave public testimony a couple of weeks back to the Supreme Court Commission in the United States about reforms to the US Supreme Court. And I benefited from David's advice and joint work in that written statement and the testimony, in which I said one of the dangers for the United States right now, and take the United States as a kind of exemplar of the kind of liberal democratic system you're talking about, Jim, is it may engage in borrowing from an illiberal, context, use the tactic, and then legitimate it, give it a kind of democratic liberal veneer that then sort of, if you like, makes it exponentially grow and do more damage. So take court packing. That's more indigenous to FDR in the United States. But let's suppose that some of the current debate about a supermajority voting rule on the US Supreme Court got traction, right? That has been, a model in some US state contexts and in Korea, but most recently, a 2/3 majority voting rule on a Supreme Court is a Polish tactic for limiting the power of the courts. We believe, and Tamara and her co-author have written about this in a really interesting way, which pushes back on this. So I want to bring that into the dialogue, but we think that's abusive in Poland. But if that tactic then gets picked up and used in the US, it gets legitimated in the global discourse in ways that then get re-imported back to, say, Kenya in ways that are clearly anti-democratic. So we actually think the bigger danger is that the Liberal Democrats pick up tools that are being used elsewhere in problematic ways. They use them, they legitimate them, and then they get kind of, if you like, released back into their natural environment in ways that are really dangerous. And that's kind of where David's, concluding note about be careful the doctrines you develop and or endorse, because sometimes that development or endorsement is then going to be really dangerous elsewhere. And so when, Australia or Germany or the US is doing constitutional development and reasoning, it actually needs to worry not only about lawfare within its own borders, but about how neighbours and friends or, former friends are going to pick up and use that for quite different ends.
Yeah, just very briefly on that. I mean, I think, we don't intend the book to be an indictment of borrowing in that sense, right? In fact, I guess the idea would be there's tons, even the forms that we pick up, contextual borrowing, selective borrowing, in a sense, those are all just features of borrowing, right? It's just that here they happen to impact the democratic minimum. Of course, I have no doubt, like I think your examples are really interesting ones where it's like Democrats can even pick up authoritarian tools for kind of pro-democratic purposes, interestingly.
Thank you. Now I think I just read out Raul's comment and question, if you don't mind, for our wider audience, and then you can answer. Yeah,
I can restate it as well, Tamay, if that's helpful.
Sorry?
Yeah, we can also restate it in answering it, whichever's easier for you.
Oh, I just read it. Okay. So Raul, I join Mila in congratulating the authors on expanding the scope to less known cases. This will be increasingly important as abusive practices continue to expand For instance, the recent examples in Brazil or El Salvador. I'm interested in your reflections about how constitutional borrowing happens and takes place. How do these dynamics operate? Are there politicians, judges, or scholar champions of abusive constitutionalism in these jurisdictions? How do they learn, communicate from each other? Very exciting group from post-fertilization with comparative politics research on the diffusion of authoritarian ideas, practices as well. The other question that comes to my mind is to what extent some of these abusive practices rely on previous institutional weaknesses and informal norms that pre-existed the authoritarian or populist episodes, and that authoritarian leaders rely on to enable an abusive constitutional agenda, for instance, previously politicized courts through informal connections or clientelists, appointments, corruptions, and so on. Again, congrats on the book. Looking forward to reading it. That was Raul Olivani. Thank you.
Thanks so much, man, Raul. David, do you want to start?
Sure. These are great questions. Very interesting questions. Difficult ones, I think. On the issue of kind of networks of abusiveness, I guess, right, which goes to the first question. We deal with that to some degree in the book, right? It's not our kind of, the way I would put it is not our kind of direct focus in a sense, because we're focused on the how, but we do uncover, we think, some evidence of these sorts of networks, right? Which are both, I think, kind of formal and informal. The sort of well-known one is this, the kind of learning that goes on in places like Hungary and then Poland, within Eastern Europe, within Latin America. This term limit example is an interesting one of where you can kind of trace the influence, and you start with a decision in Costa Rica, of all places, which says there's a right to re-election. This is from 2003, I think. There's a right to re-election. They declare a term limit, an unconstitutional constitutional amendment, and therefore revert to an earlier term limit that's a little bit looser. So they go from like a really restrictive one-term limit to a looser one. That argument gets picked up then by a number of Latin American courts, and it kind of bounces from sort of authoritarian court to authoritarian court, in a sense, where they're elaborating on and using this argument. You can see then by the time it gets to Bolivia, which is like the end of the line, the most recent decision, in some ways the most fascinating, like it's steeped in new constitutionalism, but for very anti-democratic ends. It uses all of these sophisticated doctrines like the superiority of inter-American law, for example, the prevalence of rights in constitutions over the organic part of the Constitution, all kinds of tools. But you can see in some of the argumentation that the proponents are relying on these earlier decisions. So there certainly is this kind of movement and these kinds of networks between authoritarians that we do some work, right, in uncovering, but I think there's more work to be done there in kind of figuring out how these ideas bounce and move, and how the authoritarian movement interacts with the sort of turning of liberal democratic concepts that we focus on in the book. On the informal stuff, yeah, no question that point is right. That, in other words, that there's interaction between this kind of formal level that we're looking at, the doctrines themselves, and the kind of underlying base. I would answer this question mainly in the context of the abusive judicial review phenomenon, right? Because I think that's where we've kind of developed some of the points the most. But I think I think we both think there's no question that there's a interaction that for a combination of factors largely informal. For example, some courts are going to be much easier to capture than other courts. The paradox that we draw out a little bit more in the article, I think, in some ways than the book, right? Although it's there in both, is that there may be a kind of complexity as to the impact, right? That if you're thinking about capturing a court, the payoff you get from that institution in some ways depends on it actually having a demonstrated history of independence. So that in some sense, like the prize or the payoff to authoritarians may actually be higher if the court historically was more independent, more powerful, than it is if the court just kind of has no history, right, of any independent input at all or capacity. And that, I think that point also needs kind of more elaboration and testing, but that raises this kind of interesting problem where it's easier to capture a certain kind of court, but you get less payoff. Whereas there's, the kind of more difficult the court is to capture, the higher the payoff. On the other hand, you do see examples of courts that I don't think anyone in a sophisticated domestic audience would think were independent at any point, still playing important regime functions. I would give you the example, for example, the Cambodian court that bans the opposition party. And so I think there's a set of interesting questions there, again, about the interaction between the level we're looking at and the informal level that rule is unearthing or prioritizing.
I just want to add a couple of very brief things. The first is just to agree completely with what David said. I think there is actually, that's the kind of preconditions point in particular that Raul asked about. In terms of the sort of political science literature on diffusion, we did debate a lot about how much we needed to put the diffusion story into the book, and we have a few examples of it, but actually we think there's still a lot of really interesting work to be done. So if you're a doctoral student or, an advisor of doctoral students in law or political science, I actually think that's one of the really open and important areas, is to figure out how these ideas travel. Our view is that they could travel a bunch of different ways through proximate examples, personnel, networks, and publicity. And all of those mechanisms are at work in different, cases, and they're worth studying. So, we know that there's an increasingly authoritarian network, so the Breitbart kind of world spreading ideas. One of the interesting examples we found is in relation to memory laws. The best evidence we could ascertain, and we got this from some interviews as well as, other channels, was that some of the memory laws in Rwanda came from looking across the border to Tanzania to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Tanzania, and figuring out that international law might be a tool that could be used domestically. And it was literally just, oh yeah, those guys are doing it 2 hours away. Maybe we should do it too. So I think proximate examples, personnel networks, and publicity are the mechanisms, but much more work needs to be done to figure out when they get operationalized in different contexts. And that's, it's a really open and fertile terrain. And that's the work that, people on this call and others can usefully do, that builds on and complements what we're doing, because the diffusion story requires really detailed case studies that are very grounded and do sort of process tracing. Final thing, Raul, we want to say is, we cite your work in Venezuela. It's really valuable to us. David can read the Spanish and knows a lot about it, but we, got pressed by a bunch of people, including Mark Tushnet, on, do you guys really know your case studies? And we're pretty confident that we do in most cases, know it as a matter of our own primary research. But most of our examples, we get confidence from relying on the work of other great people from, the region or the country. And in Venezuela, we rely heavily on you. So we're grateful to your work, as well as to that of many other people in this call. So thank you for your work as well as for the great.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. Thanks. So we do rely very heavily on your work.
So thank you so much. It is always fascinating listening to you, and thank you so much for the hints for further research. And I think that now Emilio would like to ask some questions.
Yeah. Quickly, thank you so much, David and Rosa. It was amazing. I am one of the ones that want to read the book as soon as possible. The first question is more like a curiosity concerning the book. In terms of rights, the discussion on rights, do you have done any kind of research on how proportionality or balancing analysis traveled all around the world and how it was misused? Because it seems such an old methodology that was going beyond several boundaries and used by several courts. And I guess that we have many examples of misuse of balancing and the proportionality. The second question concerns the relationship. Could we say that in cases of, let's say, formal democracies, if this is an appropriate expression, the case of Brazil would be or could be considered a case of weak, abusive judicial review concerning the way by which at least the Federal Supreme Court have been in the past 6 or 7 years deciding cases in a very disputable way, at least in a way that was kind of a mess concerning its own case law. So it reversed several it reversed its own jurisprudence concerning pressures that coming from huge corruption scandals. Then it came back when the Bolsonaro government started. The Federal Supreme Court started to be much more concrete in trying to find ways to preserve the Constitution and to fighting the political measures that Bolsonaro was taking. And that was just against the previous jurisprudence from the previous years. And finally, this is a kind of maybe it's more like a simple question. What could be an advice for comparativists to deal with such different contextual systems? We have in this book analysis coming from Latin America and then Cambodia and several countries in the whole world. And I always keep thinking and wondering what would be the best approach to understand so different jurisdictions. And that's all.
David, can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Amelia, thank you. These are great points and questions, and they're related. So on the latter, you know, one of the things we're trying to do with this book is create a framework and a theory and illustrations of it. And the great thing about illustrations is they can be diverse and eclectic, and there doesn't have to be a strong justification for why this example or that example, because they're examples, right? And what we try and do in the book is say, these are some pretty diverse examples. So it's not a Latin American problem or a Europe problem, it's a global problem. And, you know, one of the things is as the field gets more rich and complicated and our theories of method get more complicated, we need to pay really close attention to complicated methods about case selection and causation. But don't forget that sometimes, you know, illustrative examples, or what, you know, Mark Tushnet's recently called proof by example, and I use that in other work, you know, you can just pick diverse examples to show the breadth of the phenomenon. In terms of more detailed principles of case selection and method, that's a very important and complex question we have to kind of leave to another day. But our aim here is illustrative. A footnote to that. When you illustrate, make sure you know your examples, right? Your examples actually have to stack up within their kind of frame. And that means picking examples that are both good examples of your phenomenon and that you're competent in and confident in. And that is a mix of language, prior work, and training. Now, we picked some examples where going in, we weren't confident. Cambodia and Rwanda are not countries that we know a lot about, but we spent enough time reading and thinking and testing our intuitions against people who've done the work there, who know, you know, about it, to feel pretty confident. As well as I said before, you know, reading and thinking about Venezuela. David's done that for years, but he's also tested his intuitions against people like Raul, you know, and, you know, we've had conversations, the three of us, and separately, and that's part of how we've got it right. So illustration gives you broad permission to look around the world, but then within that, you've got to zoom in on the countries where you know you can get it right. For that reason, we actually really want you guys to write about Brazil so that, you know, the rule of law stuff and the anti-corruption discourse and the way in which the removal of Rousseff and Lula and then, the, you know, some of the Bolsonaro tactics have played out seem to us absolutely candidates of abusive borrowing, at least proto-abusive borrowing. But we didn't feel we could get on top of the fast-moving Brazilian context in ways that we wanted to be, you know, hitching our kind of flag to and saying we're confident. And so we'd really like other people on this call and listening to it on YouTube to say, you know what, I think I know enough. I'm going to have a go at talking about impeachment in Brazil and anti-corruption discourse, or proportionality discourse, or, you know, rights reasoning in the Supreme Court in ways that really use our framework, but use your expertise to test. Could balancing be that example? Absolutely. Do we say it in the book? No, we don't. We say, you know, maybe it could be, but we don't show it. And again, could Brazil over the last few years be an example? Definitely. Do we claim that it is? No, we're waiting for the work to be done by others. So it's an open invitation to collaborative dialogue in the academy for those of you who have the expertise to pick it up and to use our framework. And I just want to note that if you're thinking about the Brazilian Supreme Court, these are 4 factors that we take as useful guidance for thinking about the answer to your question. 1 is, what's the context? 2 is, what's the process? 3, are they consistent with their own prior practices and precedents? And 4, what's the impact? So asking the question, has judicial review in Brazil been abusive or weak form abusive? Could be. And in answering that question, we suggest you look at those 4 factors drawing on the book. And we are really cautious to say, you know, we've talked about a lot of countries and a lot of cases, but we're not willing to provide answers to specific examples unless and until we know enough to answer those questions. And one of the things that we hope in the next 2-3 years is we're going to get emails from folks all around the world saying, you know, we wrote this piece about, you know, El Salvador or Brazil or, you know, Nigeria. What do you think? And we're happy to respond either informally or in writing. But basically, this is a global phenomenon that requires global scholars to analyze and put their name to the project, and we'll respond. We're not trying to do every single example because you need a lot of local knowledge and attention to context to get this right. And so it's an invitation, if you like, to, you know, younger and mid-career scholars all around the world to pick up the technology and think about how it works in their context. And, you know, if you write the piece about balancing and Brazil, we'll be there to read it and, you know, comment, because it's a really important set of questions that we would really love to know more about the answer to.
Just very briefly, I agree with everything that Roz said there. I think that I think methodology is interesting in that, like, I'm a sort of by nature a kind of deep case study person in a sense. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the working in the Colombian Constitutional Court, you know, in Colombia and sort of interviewing and doing that sort of work. And I love that kind of work. And I think for me, in some ways, I had to learn how to do kind of broader studies of this sort, you know, where you're dealing with a lot of cases. I think in some ways, you know, just a couple of points. One is, this is one of the reasons I think co-authorship is so useful, right? Is that Roz and I, for example, had to have a somewhat overlapping, but somewhat distinct set of cases that we had a lot of knowledge about. We have different regional expertise. And so, you know, I think working with a co-author can be, you know, for many reasons, I think we complement each other's strengths very well, right? But this is one of them. It just has been, I don't think either of us could have written just the range of cases in this book on their own. The other thing I would say is, if you are sort of case study person, I think, you know, don't be afraid, I think, to do this kind of broader comparative study that you do want to be careful and make sure you're talking to people as well as reading the right things, right? But it is, I think, very possible to do this kind of broader work well. There is, of course, a set of trade-offs in studies where it's, you know, the sum of what your method is or ought to be is going to be dependent on the kinds of questions you're trying to answer. And a little bit of that came out, I think, in Mila's comments, where it's like we're focusing on this kind of how question, the misuse of a set of global norms. And I think that lends itself really well to the kind of study we write here, you know. the sort of micro foundation stuff, that's gonna take a somewhat different type of work, I think, to tease out. So your method also, this is obvious, right? But your method needs to be guided by the kind of question you're trying to answer. Basically, on Brazil, I don't think I can add much, right? To us, we had a lot of conversations about Brazil in the course of writing the book, and about the nature of the case. And I think, well, one thing I would say is, there's one case that to me always draws a set of analogs. I'm not trying to say it's very similar, right? But that we do cover in the book, which is Thailand. And Thailand, I think, is really interesting in that, obviously, a very different context. But you have courts in Thailand that take a bunch of actions against a particular type of leader. And, actually, this vaccine is a threat to democracy. In a way that's very different than the Brazilian case, but they consistently are trying to get this actor and the allies of this actor out of politics. It's hard to tell exactly why. One story is that they were authentically thought that vaccine was a serious threat. Another is that they were basically acting on behalf of another set of actors in a way where it was knowingly abusive. There's some evolution, we think, in the story over time. But regardless, the end state is that they created the kind of vacuum where anti-democratic actors thrived. And in fact, you end up in a hardcore military coup, right? And so what is interesting, I would just raise for discussion, is that there's this range, where I think the intent factor that Roz raised in her initial comments are really important and kind of varies across cases. And there's also this sort of range where it's clearly going to be the case that the effect is different in a different set of cases. But one way you get this kind of abuse that is kind of interesting is you create this kind of vacuum or space where anti-democratic actors can thrive precisely because you over-regulate the democratic sphere in the name of another set of values like corruption, right? And so I think that's a very interesting story that has some analogs in the Brazilian case.
Thank you so much for your insight, advices, and encouragement. And Rosa, I think that you've got a lot of emails from young scholars or not that young, maybe. And I think that we still have some minutes for the last question. We have a question from Christiane Assis, and the question is, if it is possible that norms are inappropriately used, is there any solution to abusive constitutionalism that can be accomplished through norms?
David, you go. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay.
Well, I just have to go in a minute. No, I can take it. I think the main thing is deep cultural sort of instantiation of liberal democracy makes a system quite resilient to this tactic, right? But it also requires a mix of what is a deep and very sincere commitment and a kind of cynical realist sensibility. So Americans in law school are very realist, right? There's nothing there. It's all manipulable in a way that I think needs to travel. So we need more global legal realism in Brazil and Australia. But at the same time, in becoming realists, we shouldn't become pure instrumentalists all the way down. We have to hold on to the idea that there's a liberal democratic ethos and set of norms which aren't susceptible to manipulation. So we need to be realists without being full instrumentalists. And if we can get that, then this tactic doesn't work because we know what our commitments are and we're skeptical of certain kind of discourse, which is kind of hollow and substanceless. So if we can get that right, we're fine. But it's a very hard combination to instantiate. And I think it needs to be instantiated, in law school, but also in a broader political sort of, civics context. And that's even harder, but that's the holy grail.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we wrote the last chapter of the book, which is on the solutions part, basically, we go through the problem, the entire book. And then at the end, we're like, well, what do you do? What do you do about it? That last piece is where we are, and really this goes back even to 2013 article I wrote on abusive constitutionalism. It's very hard to combat this, right? I mean, this is this is why it's an effective tactic. I think to answer the question, like Oz is right. Like there are things one can do, but they're not easy things, right? To accomplish. And a lot of what we're saying in that last chapter kind of is there are things that would help, but they're not going to get rid of the tactic, right? I do think that having actors both internationally and domestically more attuned to it, being more careful the way we talk about certain norms is going to help to some degree. But if a lot of the solutions to this are kind of like deep cultural immersion, real commitment to liberal democracy, like authentic commitment on the part of the population, then I think you have to ask yourself, like, where does that exist, right? Where is that? Where do you see that? And I think that's where some of the pessimism comes in, right? I mean, I think that you look at the U.S. I think Mila was alluding to some of the survey research she's doing. It's like, well, you've got a substantial element of authoritarianism among the population, right, in the U.S. And I think that's true virtually everywhere. So you are talking about a problem that is deeply difficult to resolve. And I think the most one could do, there's the way we would kind of think about it, two prongs. I mean, one is the conceptual level, being more aware, having a more legal realist take, as Roz was just saying, having international institutions that are more tuned and better set up, having scholars be more careful in the way they discuss and promulgate norms. And then, making constitutions more resilient, which really is our next project to this kind of phenomenon. But none of that is easy, right? It's all going to be very difficult. And I think you're dealing with things that are going to manage the risk better, but certainly not make these risks go away.
Thank you, David. So I think that this would be the end of our lecture today. And I would like to thank you, David and Rosalind and Mia, for joining us and talked about abusive constitutional borrowing. And I think that we need to keep on this liberal constitutional efforts, as you said, and do more local research and comparative research alone or with co-authors. And I think that one of the most important message here, at least for me, is again the invitation that Rose just offered. So those scholars who are doing this type of research, feel free to approach them and share your research with David and Rose. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and Anna and Bruno, Emilio, everyone for organizing it. It's a big feat to do this kind of multi-time zone, multi-institutional effort, and it's a really great opportunity. So thank you all for your organization as well as your invitation.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you all so much for the invitation, and it's been a pleasure. It's been really interesting for us.